I had received 6 patents when I was at MIT in large screen displays and had licensed those to a company called Advent Corporation in Cambridge because they made the first projection television, and they made a very unique picture tube, and I had patents on that type of tube that used my type of phosphor. So I knew they were having troubles. They'd actually declared bankruptcy, and it really threw me for a loop. I was in my office at UK, it's when I was still on faculty, and got a phone call from their vice president, and he said, would you help us sell our picture tube manufacturing equipment to RCA, Raytheon, or General Electric? Because he said, we know you want that tube to stay alive, and you have contacts with those people. So I told him I'd have to think about it, and I called him back. There's some real urgency on their behalf because they were getting ready to get shut down. So I walked across the street and went over to the Arby's that's still there, and sat in a front booth and just really thought about, all right, what does this mean? What's the situation? If came to the conclusion, it's almost that if Raytheon, RC, or GE bought that equipment, they would have stripped it and used it for their more normal TV picture tubes, because projection TV just didn't have a market at that time. Interest rates were very high. It was in 1982. Interest rates were around 22%, and $3,000 TVs weren't selling very much. And it just hit me from say it's as if the Lord came to me and said, if you're going to get a company going, this is your chance. You got to take a risk, and you've got to get that equipment yourself. And so I went back and I called Tom, and I said, if I can get a good enough deal from you, I'll move your equipment here to Kentucky. I'll set it up and I'll make picture tubes for you. But if you provide that equipment to those big companies, they're going to strip it and use it for their standard practice, and that tube's going to be dead. And so I had to go up and negotiate with the bankruptcy judge. Ended up moving 70 tons of equipment, 7 United Van Line trucks full of used equipment. I had never made a picture tube in my life. I had to go out that Sunday after church. Patsy and I went out to find a warehouse or someplace to put the stuff because I didn't have a place, and we found a place on Big Run Road. And so Labor Day of 1982, we unloaded 7 trucks worth of equipment, and I met, fortunately, a customer while I was sitting in the Advent waiting room. He had a British accent, and he said he was there to get 3 picture tubes that Advent owed him for some time. They had a flight simulator, and they were wanting to use projection. And I had to tell him, there's no power here. Everybody in the back has been laid off except for the front office people. I'm not sure what they're going to tell you, but I said, I'm going to get this equipment. I'm going to move it to Kentucky, and I'm going to develop a very special tube, which is much higher quality than these consumer TVs. Fortunately, I had a business card on my company I just named, left it with him. And within a few days after returning to Kentucky, I got a call from that company. And their purchasing agent came. At the time, I was going into this plumber's warehouse with all this used equipment, and he was kind of shocked that he thought I could do anything. Their point he made to me was, this was in September. He said, if you can make us some tubes before the end of the year, we'll consider buying some from you. But if you can't, then we're going to have to go with Sony or Hitachi and go more standard. So December 17th of 1982, we shipped a red, green, and blue picture tube to Rediffusion. And they called me after they tested them. They said, these are actually better than what Advent made. And there's no way they could have been, but they needed them so badly that they liked them. They ordered 90 tubes from me, and that's what got me started. So, well, if I had made calls to GE, Raytheon, or RCA and said, here's a chance for you all to buy a lot of equipment cheap, then that would have been done. I wouldn't have had access to that technology. Mm-hmm. It was a very unique picture tube. It had a mirror inside the tube, had a metal substrate. It had a lot going for it for flight simulators and for teleconferencing. But that wasn't a market back then. This was way before people really realized what the market could be, and there was no way that those three companies in that economic environment were going to get into a new product line that wasn't already established. So my two choices were either be a good guy and help them sell that equipment and be a professor the rest of my life and give up on this idea, or take a pretty high risk and get this equipment down here and see if I can make it work. Henry Kloss was the founder of Advent. He also had started a company called AR, Acoustics Research, and was the father of stereo here in the United States. He brought Dolby acoustics to the United States, chromium dioxide tape for very high quality tape. The Advent stereo loudspeaker was a real hot item. But he had left Advent when they got in trouble and started another company, Kloss Video Corporation, and had fallen out with the leaders at Advent. He called me one day at UK, and he said, "Lee, I was over by Advent, and I saw these trucks being loaded, and the rumor is that you're getting all that equipment." And I said, "Yes, sir." I said, "I would like to talk to you about that, but I know your legal situation, and I didn't want to put you in an awkward position." He said, "Do you really think you can move that equipment and get it to work again?" I said, "Henry, I don't need to be hearing that from you."
Yeah, not now.
And so he said, "Well, anything I can do to help, I'll help." And so we became close friends, and we talked quite a bit and swapped stuff back and forth between the two companies. But that was my choice: either give up on the whole concept or really take a big risk and do it myself.
Yeah.
My last year at MIT, I got into patents. I was interested in starting a company. I had never had a business course. Still haven't. But MIT started what they call independent activities period, where there was a lot of pressure during the Vietnam War. Students were upset. And so they decided that they would take the entire month of January and make it an independent period where you can take any course you want to without grades, just to take the pressure off and let you do what you wanted to do. But one of the things they offered during that period of time was a seminar series called Development of the Enterprises. And a guy named Richard Morris organized it. Mr. Morris had a company called American Vacuum Company and had patented freeze-dried coffee and frozen orange juice. So he was an entrepreneur and well off. And the real beneficial thing he did with these, he had 6 entrepreneurs to speak over that 4-week period. And he told them, you come in and tell your war stories for 30 minutes. That's what you'll want to do.
Yeah.
But the last 30 minutes, you've got to give 10 ways to achieve success or avoid failure. And 2 of the entrepreneurs had gone bankrupt, and they were at it again, trying to get started. 2 had gone public and were very successful. And 2 had just raised their money and were getting ready to start seeing if they could really do it or not.
Yeah.
And one of those 2 was Amar Bose. And he was just starting in Bose Acoustics. Turned out he was on my master's committee as well.
Oh, okay.
And so after I left Tech and went back to UK, I would call him on occasions and tell him, I'm trying to raise money, trying to price my stock. Does this sound right? Or, I'm trying to get some money out of a bank down here. They won't talk to me. Would I be able to bank this deal in Boston? And in some cases, he'd say, you should be able to bank it. And here, and if they won't bank it for you, I can, introduce you to somebody up here that will bank it. Or that's pretty risky stuff. You're probably going to have to sell some stock, for some other condition, and because the banks probably wouldn't bank that even up here in Boston. So
yeah.
But that was what really helped me. But the side effect of that was that the last day, a gentleman came in and attended the very last session. I forget who the speaker was, and when it was over, he came up to me and he said, "I noticed you took some pretty extensive notes during this time, and would you mind to go to lunch and just kind of tell me what's been going on?" Turns out his name was John Masuris, and he was a Rhodes Scholar. He had been in Cambridge, but had gotten tired of working in abstract mathematics. So he came back to MIT to get a job as a technician working with Project Mac, which was the artificial intelligence project, just to get some hands-on experience with engineering. he and his college roommate, when he was a freshman, when they were freshmen, started a ceramic engine company because they felt from physics that they had studied that that would be a very efficient engine. They raised $1 million as freshmen at Harvard, and it didn't make it. They hired Bill Lear of Learjet fame, his ceramist, and they made a run at it, but it didn't work. But John was able to take me down to Boston, right there by the gold-domed Capitol building, and have lunch with a guy named Goodhue, who was the lawyer who helped he and his friend raise that $1 million. And it was interesting to me because I figured, well, somebody invested in something, you went bankrupt, they're never going to speak to you again. But Mr. Goodhue was extremely pleased to see John, wanted to know how he was doing and so forth. He said, I wrote that. Yeah, I said, we wrote our investment off in you, last year, and we figured it wasn't going to go anywhere. Wished him luck, and it was just a very delightful meal. And that was a real revelation to me that there are investors who take risk and don't hold you responsible for the rest of your life if you don't make it. I lost track of John. Actually, one time he and I, his college roommate his sophomore year was William Randolph Hearst III, and known as Willie. And this was when Patty Hearst had been kidnapped, his cousin, and Willie was traveling around to keep from getting kidnapped himself. And John called me one night, and he said, Willie is in New York, and he wants to see your technology. He said, you think your car can make it? I had a 69 Dodge Coronet. So we drove to New York City, and I got my little 35 millimeter or Super 8 millimeter projector and took it into the Hearst building and made a pitch to Willie Hearst. And we didn't get anything out of it. It was, I was far too ahead of the market for that. But it kept me going. It gave me a chance to expose my ideas to somebody. They didn't say you're crazy. They didn't say you shouldn't do this. They said this is eventually going to happen, and But then I lost track of John when I graduated until I'd been at DataBeam for a few years. So this was probably 8 or 10 years later. I opened up the Wall Street Journal one day, and in the second section, front page, there was one of these pencil-type caricatures of John Masuris. The headline said, Gates says Masuris is one of the brightest people he's ever met. And so as I read the story, John had gone back to Cambridge and finished his Rhodes, and then came back and worked at IBM with a gentleman where they developed the RISC technology for computer chips. And then they started a company called MIPS Corporation, which is still a public company now, and it's done very, very well. But John had sold his interest in that and had started another company called MicroUnity. And MicroUnity was going to build the first digital set-top box that he's going to make his own chips using his technology. He built a semiconductor factory in Santa Clara, which nobody thought would make any sense. But Gates had put in $10 million personally. The fellow Malone, who was the big guy in cable TV, had put in $10 million. So he'd raised about $80 million from some heavy hitters. I called him that day and said, I'm going to be in California in a few weeks. Let's have dinner, and we did. And he told me, he said, boy, I hope this works. He said, I've really got some hot shots on this board. And it didn't work. He didn't make it. The market wasn't ready for that. And so, again, I kind of lost track of him. About a year ago, I Googled him just to see if MicroUnity was still in business. And it turned out that he had just settled a suit with Sony because he gave back money to all the heavy-duty investors he had, but he kept a core software team together. And it turned out they had developed a lot of technology and gotten patent protection on it. Sony had used some of that in the PlayStation. Intel had used some of it in the Pentium chip. And so he got something like a $20 million settlement with Sony. And Intel had kind of decided to do a settlement with him rather than go through a trial because they saw that he had already won that first case. Yeah. And so Intel was going to pay him. So I haven't called him since then, but he was just one of the fascinating people that I met. That's kind of a serial entrepreneur, risk taker, bright as he could be, and that started by my attending that seminar. I got a chance to meet him and Bose. I met Bose, but I knew so much more about Bose after I heard him speak that when I saw him in the hallway, I had a lot more of a conversation I could have with him, and I could tell him what I was wanting to do. Back to teach at MIT.
Yeah.
The students knew that, 6 years before that I'd sat in their seats, and so every now and then when we'd end class early, they'd ask questions about it, and I still remember the first time they said, what are some differences between UK and MIT? And I told them, I said, well, for one thing, if you're walking through the student lounge on Monday morning, they're not talking about basketball. They're talking about doing something different to really take out a competitor, start a new company, or they could build something better than somebody else. But secondly, they didn't go to MIT expecting to work for somebody else all their lives. I said, here you all have a goal of go to college so you can get a job with an IBM or a Hewlett Packard. But in their case, it's they want to go to college and create jobs. And I said, that's the difference in the attitude. And they feel that sooner or later, some of those bright people that they go to school with will join with them, and they'll go out and start their own business. And they've done it. So.
And how about on the faculty side, kind of the differences that you see there sometimes?
You get inspired because you walk around and you see Amar Bose. You saw Doc Edgerton, who was the father of high-speed photography. He started a company called EG&G, which was very successful. Was into time-lapse photography. You saw a guy named R.B. Adler, who had started a semiconductor company for some of the early semiconductor work. And you just kind of heard stories about them all the time, about how they got going and, how they started their companies and, how many students were now working in those operations. The story I tell is about when I was at UK teaching, we had a new dean to come to he was actually from inside UK, and he was promoted to dean. And so he knew that I was trying to start a company. He wasn't in my department, he was in another department. But he called me to his office the first day he was dean. And he said, tell me about this company you have going, and how can you have a company and still be a professor? And I told him, I said, well, if I was still at MIT and I didn't have a company, Dean would call me to the office and say, why aren't you doing something with the company? And I said, when I feel that it will take too much time so I can't do this job, I'll just leave, and which I did a year later. So at MIT, they embraced that. The other difference attitudinally was not just the faculty, and a lot of the faculty were either concerned or jealous, and I often say the ones that gave me the most trouble were the ones who worked a good 20 hours a week and then went out and managed their tobacco or sold their real estate, whatever. But mine effort was pretty high profile because I talked about it to all the students all the time. But also in the community, the difference you found was that in Boston you could go out and talk to Charles Goodhue about helping you raise $1 million, or Dr. Bose could leave for 1 year and he could put a whole team together to start his company, and then he could go back and teach. But when I tried to get DataBeam started, one, it took me 7 years to raise the money to get going because nobody understood what I was doing. But secondly, I didn't have people here who understood how to get a technology company going. I ended up with my marketing company being in New Hampshire. My law firm was in Palo Alto. A lot of the construction was done up in Ohio near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base of the circuit boards. We had to begin to create the environment in Lexington to allow you to easily start a company. And so that's one thing that I think has gotten better over the years. In the past, it appears to me, as I said before, students want to go to college to get a job. Now I think they're beginning to understand that they're probably not going to work for the same company for 30 years because things are changing so much right now. But you have all the people who are enamored with athletics and think that's a career and that they can make a lot of money in when very few do. So I made a comment when IBM purchased DataBeam. One of our young software developers bought a Corvette. Another young lady in our customer support area bought a BMW convertible. I bought a Jaguar. And I told them, and there were others that bought new cars. And I told them one day at a meeting, I said, what we ought to do is put placards on the back of our cars that said, we don't play basketball, we write software, and drive around the UK campus to try to get people to understand, hey, this is pretty cool. So
that's awesome.
So we're trying to change attitudes and
Yeah.
change expectations and open up the minds of people that they can be creative and start their own businesses.